Hello AP students, this is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for Chapter 14, Social Psychology. So let's begin. Social psychology is a branch of psychology that affects social variables and cognitions, basically dealing with individual behavior and social interactions. This field of psychology investigates how individuals affect each other. They also explore the forces that bring people together for friendship and loving relationships. And we need to talk about some terminology, and so we're going to start with social context. This is a combination of the people, the activities, the interacting among people, perhaps the setting in which the behavior occurs, and the expectations and social norms governing behavior in that setting. And a very famous psychologist, this man down below here, Phil Zimbardo, actually did an experiment in 1971 called the Stanford Prison Experiment. Okay, this underscores the power of social situation to control human behavior. One of the things that happened is that he had a group of subjects, and I think there were roughly 18 subjects in this situation. 9 of them portrayed the roles of prisoners, and 9 of them portrayed the roles of the guards. And in the course of just literally a few hours, this whole experiment kind of went crazy in the sense that none of these participants and the subjects had been coached on how to behave, but yet within hours of taking on these roles, the subjects, for the most part, started conveying basically the norms of what would be expected of somebody who would be a prisoner, or the norms of someone who would be a guard. So, psychologists know that it is not objective reality that we respond to. We respond to our subjective interpretation of situations, our perceptions, which can differ significantly from person to person. So in the case of this Stanford prison experiment, really it didn't take long for the subjects to perceive what their roles were and to take on those roles with a lot of accuracy, unfortunately. This is the second great theme in social psychology, the construction of subjective social reality, and to promote the human condition. How does the social situation affect our behavior? Social psychologists believe that even when situation might be familiar, such as a college classroom, the primary determinant of the individual behavior is the social situation in which that behavior occurs. So powerful is the situation that it sometimes can dominate our personalities, override our past history of learning, values, and beliefs. We usually adapt our behavior to the demands of the social situation. And in ambiguous situations, we take our cues from the behavior of others in that setting. Situationism is kind of what this all is. It's the view that the environmental conditions influence people's behavior as much or as more than their personal dispositions do. Situationism is contrasted with dispositionism, the tendency to attribute your behavior to internal factors such as genes, traits, or character qualities. Social standards of behavior. In a job interview, this provides an example of the situational influence on our behavior as we try to do what is right in front of the prospective employer. Most people learn to size up their social circumstances and to make their behavior conform to the situational demands. And this can be done through kind of learning those social roles and understanding the norms of the groups that we're going to be involved in. Social roles. People operate by rules that depend on their social role. Social roles, this is one of the several socially defined patterns of behavior that are expected of persons in a given setting or group. The rules that we assume may result from our interests, our abilities, or our goals, or they may be imposed on us by the group or the culture or the economic or the biological conditions beyond our control. The script, this is a cluster of knowledge about the sequences of events and actions expected to occur in a particular setting. So if we go back and talk about the Stanford Prison Experiment, for the most part, the students, they took on the roles of being the prisoner or took on the roles of being a guard. If the individual understands the role of the guard as someone who uses coercive rules to limit the freedom of our prisoners, then that person is likely to use a script derived from that schema to become an authoritarian guard under the conditions such as the Stanford Prison Experiment. Within hours of this experiment starting, it had to be stopped because some of our prisoners, for the most part, were under such distress. And some of our guards had, for the most part, become a little too brutal. So things had to be wrapped up. But it really gave us an understanding of this concept of obedience. Social norms. Social norms are a group's expectations regarding what is appropriate and acceptable of its members' attitudes and behaviors. Norms can guide our conversation as we kind of restrict conversations of sensitive or taboo subjects in the presence of certain company. The adjustment of a group typically involves discovering its social norms. Individuals experience this adjustment in two ways. First, by noticing the uniformities and regularities in the certain behaviors. So you might observe the group of people that you're in and kind of watch what they're doing, and if everybody's doing things a certain way, then you kind of follow suit. It can also be done by observing the negative consequences when someone violates the social norm. So you're watching to see if somebody is getting punished. A lot of this can be done through social learning, in observational learning. So it kind of goes back to some of the things that we talked about with Albert Bandura. Social norms and the influence on students' political views. The man that we see here, Theodore Newcomb, he did an experiment back in the 1930s, and part of this experiment was to kind of figure out the political views on the faculty and how of the college that he was observing, and how those political views could influence the students. And the college that he chose was Vermont's Bennington College. In the 1930s, this was a liberal arts school. It had students that probably came from very well-to-do families, and many of these families politically were very conservative. The faculty was young and dynamic and had a tendency to be a little more liberal in their politics. So social psychologist Theodore Newcomb wondered which forces most likely shaped the attitudes of these students, be it their family or the faculty of the campus that they were on. And so he did a longitudinal study of following these students and watching other students over the years. So the norms of the campus were kind of against the norms, I should say, of not so much the campus, but of the home. Most women in their initial conversations, for the most part, were holding a conservative attitude, and this was transformed as they progressed through college. And so by the time they were seniors, a lot of them had converted to kind of a liberal line of thinking or supporting liberal causes. 20 years later, women who had graduated as liberals were still, for the most part, liberals. A minority that had resisted the prevailing liberal norm remained conservative. This was accomplished in part by marrying their own kind politically. What's interesting is one of these students that actually happened to be part of the study at Bennington would go on to be a former First Lady, Betty Ford. And Betty Ford, her husband, Gerald Ford, was a very conservative Republican president. So it is kind of interesting how that all plays out. One's workplace, neighborhood, religious group, and family all communicate the standard of behavior. The threat and sanctions for violating these norms, are probably well stated within these environments. New college students commonly adapt their classmates' political opinions. And this was kind of shown in the Bennington study. And also, they frequently would take on the religious beliefs of classmates as well as the attitudes about sex and alcohol. Thank you very much.